Just as I begin, I'll just offer a content warning that in this talk I'll describe, but not refer to, but not describe directly some traumatic circumstances, including violence, sexual assault, abuse, hate speech, death, lying, sexism, misogyny, ableism, and classism. And I want to acknowledge that although we are an international audience today, I'm going to be speaking largely from the context of the United States, although I myself am not an American, but rather a Canadian. All right, so music is not an automatic good. We commonly speak of music as though it were a divine machine, a universal apparatus that builds bridges, gives hope, builds peace, ennobles us, empowers us, expresses the inexpressible, and transcends all time. But music is not a divine machine. It's a complex set of social practices that are hardwired into every human culture. It is both reflective of and productive of various forms of trauma. So for the past 15 years, I've taught aspiring professional musicians in elite music conservatories here in the United States. And for the past 10 years, I've played a lead role in developing required entrepreneurship classes in these schools. And now I'm a member of a research lab funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, launching a long-term longitudinal study on professional training here in the US, a place where I sometimes suspect that the professional musician is in danger of becoming something of an endangered species. So when COVID silenced the music profession here in 2020, it laid bare the fault lines of neoliberal economies. Among them, income inequality, escalating cost of living, rising tuition, and student loan debt. These challenge the claims of professional training programs that present musical achievement as a meritocracy and entrepreneurship as an opportunity rather than a necessity. And this has prompted me to reckon with my place in a system that profits from young musicians' labor and ambition. So in this session, I'd like to describe how this reckoning shifted the ways in which I teach entrepreneurship, from a practice that centered the music industry and musicians' desires for access to one that centers musical practice and the needs of practitioners, a process that aligns well with practices of trauma-informed care and pedagogy. I'll discuss definitions of trauma, situating these in recent experiences in the United States. I'll introduce principles of trauma-informed teaching and learning as I've applied them to my entrepreneurship curricula. So trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound. In common use, it is a spacious word. There is no objective measure of trauma. A particular event or circumstance may be experienced as traumatic by one individual, but not by another. So indeed, it's an individual's experience that determines whether an event is traumatic or not. And the adverse effects of trauma are variable too. They might be felt right away or years later. They might last for a short or a long time. And the effects of traumatic events are not limited to those directly impacted. Traumatic stressors can be transmitted vertically and horizontally through families and communities and generations. People can be traumatized vicariously by living inside cultures and systems that sustain racist, violent, and injurious actions. And the term complex trauma describes exposure to multiple traumas, typically of an interpersonal nature, and their wide-ranging long-term impacts on mental health. This spaciousness of trauma, its limitless manifestations and configurations, contributes to a habit of thinking that trauma is somehow mysterious and exceptional when it is not. It is ubiquitous and endemic. Now, it's a commonplace of COVID to say that we live in traumatogenic times. A book on trauma by psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk has been on the New York Times paperback nonfiction list for 162 weeks. Since February 14th, it's been at #1. And you might think that it's the pandemic that's responsible for this reader's interest, but the pandemic itself is not a trauma. It's a challenging event which for some people might turn into a trauma. And the difference lies in inequality, how different groups of the population are very differently affected. So since the beginning of last year, I've taught through epidemics of wildfires, floods, heat waves, police shootings, school shootings, protests, layoffs, and a major economic collapse. I was coaching a masterclass on the afternoon of January 6th this year when a violent mob of terrorists stormed the nation's capital wearing symbols of genocide. I taught through an unyielding national politics that exploited each of these events for political gain. And none of my students experienced these events in the same way. One was in their spacious family home, focused on practicing, adept at streaming concerts with a Venmo tip jar. One was struggling to keep up with their assignments while managing their children's homeschooling. One was an Instagram influencer who privately confessed to me her absolute exhaustion. One was making long commutes to late night gigs in another state with less restrictive social distancing laws. One was suffering the anxiety of trying not to get sick, not to get killed by the police, not to get vicariously traumatized by the news, while weighing numerous requests to share their experience of racial trauma through unpaid service on panels, committees, and advisory groups. One was grieving her father's death from COVID, an event that turned any COVID silver lining into tinfoil. And meanwhile, trauma was already coded into the DNA of the professional musical training. Like the idea of talent, which is mysterious but undisputed, really that some bodies are more talented or better than others. It's in the power dynamics of student-mentor relationships, where a studio teacher holds the power to make or break you. The demands of an industry where competition is all pervasive, where everything you do depends on competition and the inside track. It's in the idea that you're vying your whole young life for a seat in this or a role on that, all the while submitting yourself to the assessment of gatekeepers who make the decisions about your livelihood. It's a history where female performers serve as muses and resonators for male genius, where master male pedagogues regularly marry their much younger female students, where sisters like Nana Mozart or Fanny Mendelssohn and wives like Clara Schumann give way to brothers and husbands. It's a world where it took a concert violinist, Lara St. John, 33 years of strenuous effort to get her school, the Curtis Institute of Music, to admit what they already knew, that her teacher, Joseph Brodsky, had raped her when she was a child and threatened to send her and her brother back to Canada should she speak up. So to be serious about professional training in a system like this one is to be educated in a system that might decimate you. And anything that throws you off your game or threatens the status quo has the potential to derail your professional career. So it's no wonder that we learn to keep quiet about trauma. So I began to wonder in this time, what would happen if we approached training musicians by acknowledging trauma rather than concealing it? So trauma-informed teaching and learning describes an approach to pedagogy that centers students' past and present experience of trauma and its effects on their well-being. So a trauma-informed approach asks that we recognize and acknowledge trauma, that we help ourselves and our students to feel safe, empowered, and connected. It demands that we recognize the impacts of collective trauma, and personal trauma might mean that students have a difficult time completing seemingly basic tasks. It means acknowledging that we as faculty might have those troubles too. It requires dismantling hierarchies and promoting interdependence, teaching with and not to. It asks that we not pretend. Now, not pretending is also radical in entrepreneurship, a field that profits from unmet promises too frequently. So let's take the promises of Spotify and Patreon, two tech companies that are promoting new models of livelihood for artists. So Spotify's mission statement promises to give, quote, 1 million creative artists the opportunity to live off their art. But out of the estimated 8 million creators on Spotify, only 13,000 generated royalties over $50,000 in 2020. That's a little over 0.1%. Now, Patreon says they're, quote, proud and motivated that creators rely on this for their paycheck and ultimately their creative freedom. But in October 27, less than 2% of those creators, 1,393 precisely, were earning over minimum wage. And if you jack up the minimum wage in the US to $15, where it really rightly belonged then, the number jumped down to 0.08%. And it's not just big tech. During the pandemic, my social media feeds turned up more and more posts from artists turned coaches who were capitalizing on musicians' unemployment and their anxieties. Services with names like Audition Hacker, the Productive Musician, the Millionaire Musician, the Bulletproof Musicians, all peddling online courses and coaching services that were catering to musicians' COVID fears, promising mastery, fulfillment, and invulnerability. So how do you teach, though, for a future ethically that is fundamentally unknown? So I chose in this to not make false promises and to honor struggle and vulnerability. I chose to promote resiliency, mutual aid and recovery, and borrowing a line from the poet Adrienne Rich's essay, Claiming an Education, I chose to enjoin my students in a pledge of mutual seriousness, to take their learning seriously, which means taking them seriously and taking music seriously.
10 minutes.
So what this has meant in practice, a lot of it really just comes down to good pedagogy. And the basic principles, I think, are simple. They're safety, trust, transparency, support, collaboration, mutuality, empowerment, voice, choice, liberation, resilience. Although we could spend much more time than I have today to unpack each of these. I've summarized each of these, which I adapted those lists of 7 basic principles from Janice Corello, and I've applied them to musical contexts. I put these in a handout that I'll post in chat. I'll give you a link and I'll also give you a PDF. And I'll just spend a few minutes unpacking 2 or 3 of these and how I've applied them in classroom practices and pedagogies. So safety refers to creating environments where learners feel physically and emotionally safe. And I think the safety should be understood in the terms of those being served and extended beyond the place of instruction. So I might consider every musical act as taking place in a space of teaching and learning. So one thing I might do is ask, how are you, and listen. I do this in many different ways. At 3 points during the semester, I offer reflection assignments that are graded essentially on a pass-fail basis. So you just do them and you receive your credit. I ask questions like, are you healthy and safe? Are your basic living needs being met? I ask about how COVID has impacted people's thinking and their goals, how it's impacted their learning in the course, how comfortable they are with either Zoom instruction or our return to on-campus instruction, and what we might do to increase students' feelings of safety in the classroom. And I review these before one-on-one conferences with students, so I have an active sense of what challenges they might be facing. I might also ask these questions in little hallway moments in Zoom before and after class, intentionally lingering before and after to catch students in more informal conversations. Trust and transparency is woven throughout my mechanisms, but I think the one I'd like to highlight the most right now is the degree to which I both empower students and join them in a process of making community agreements to discuss continually how we will refine and rededicate our syllabus and our course activities to meeting their needs. And also, I'd like to highlight the idea of empowering students with accurate information. So to be very precise in supporting my claims with evidence through research and both lived experience. So for example, data on Spotify and Patreon, I will give links to studies, I will find links to the data sources, and I provide all of these in peer-reviewed studies and other such things in a dynamically updated syllabus. The impact is that I model precision in thought and critical thinking and research skills, but also skills for case making, for identifying things that other people may not see as problems, and strategies for solving those. Liberation, I'd like to highlight largely through a commitment to really dismantling careerist conceptions of musical success, to accept that we are all musicians and that there are as many musical careers as there are musicians. This means often dismantling ableist, middle-class, metropolitan, white-centered perspectives. It means doing so through the kinds of readings that I suggest, the kinds of guests that I bring into class spaces, and a commitment to continually testing assumptions and discussions in our class along the lines of race, class, age, ability, and other structures of privilege. So for example, when Yo-Yo Ma hit the national news early in the pandemic, suggesting that musicians should enable what he called the 101 principle by making tailored videos for strangers on their smartphones. And he said, I should hope every musician would have a smartphone. We're able to interrogate this in light of average incomes faced by our graduates, adjunct student loan debt, cost of living, loss of income, and impacts of COVID-19 on revenues. So I'll sum up by saying that I don't think we need to be martyrs to music. And an expectation we have of wounds and trauma is that they should heal and vanish, that they are pathologies that should be treated and cured. I think it's more apt to think of our wounds as being a part of us and proof of our capacity and resilience, the embodied text of our history. So Adrienne Rich, in a poem about Marie Curie, also wrote that she died a famous woman, denying that her wounds came from the same source as her power. My wish at this time of intersecting precarities is that we all join in a collective project of redefining the nature, relevance, and purpose of professional training and our traumas. My goal is to effect a fundamental shift away from using music as a site of reinscribing existing power structures towards music as an imaginative, empathic, and very pragmatic response. The sound of our imagining and enacting a world, not as it is, but as it should be. Thank you very much.
Well done, Tanya. Extraordinary. Thank you. And thank you so much for sharing that PDF with us as well. That's a fantastic list. And I think that's really rich with information. And you've even given us exemplars of assessment. So that's, yeah, incredibly generous of you to share your work with us as well. I'll just throw out some questions to the floor. Netta's saying, thank you very much. Karen's great presentation. Sue Ferris says, strong. So that was excellent. We have one hand up from Matthew Flynn.
Hi, Tanya, thanks for that great and very sobering analysis. I agree with an awful lot of what you're saying about redefining the musicians that we teach, thinking about the realities of the industry that we're going into. And it sounds like you've given them a series of reality checks. But I just wonder how difficult you found it in terms of still overcoming the sort of myths that they arrive with in terms of their industry aspirations, and also this idea that to a certain extent to succeed, they've got to suspend belief and reality to give them the motivation to plow on through to actually develop careers.
Right. So it's this requires much more nuancing than I could give in the short period of time that we had. But in short, this has to be cultivated on individual levels, on the level of class. Every classroom, I mean, the classroom environment is its own community. In the different schools where I teach, every one class is a world unto itself, with different configurations also of national identities, of professional cultures. I may have people coming from wildly different expectations. So undergraduate needs are different from graduate students' needs. Students in mandatory classes are really different from the needs of students in elective classes. So in short, it's a delicate dance between honoring and holding out space for possibility. I think that point that I really speeded through, that idea of encouraging people to think that there are as many musical careers as there are musicians, and we are all musicians, requires dismantling this kind of like careerist or ableist or talent-centered or meritocratic notion, and thinking more critically and clearly about the other kinds of factors that influence what we think of as success. And so too rarely conceptions of success are based on supposition or based on received cultural information. And what I try to do is to get students to author their own definitions of success. So one of the things that I adopted during COVID was an assignment that's linked in the handout called a learning portfolio and declaration of intent. And you'll see that in the assignment sheet, there's about 25 or 30 different reflections that I give them the options of doing in various settings, either on online discussions, through in-class activities. And I ask them to revisit these at the end of the semester to curate from them the 5 selections that they feel most represents their learning, and from there to write either a manifesto, a mission statement, some other way that tracks their evolving sense of what success will be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I suppose, the individual approach, I think, is, can be a sort of, I'm coming out from my own perspective, hence the model that I devised, is because you're dealing with, large lecture theatres of students and sort of, or small seminar groups at the very best. And so to try and build that individuality in, as well as giving them ways and structures to think about their individual career paths is something I'm always trying to wrestle with and balance better. It was really insightful what you said, and I'll certainly read the handout and try and adapt and adopt some of your methods.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that students' relationships to livelihood. Livelihood is just one measure, like where you get your money from. And so to interrogate sort of musicalist or careerist conceptions of livelihood that center certain kinds of musical revenues over others, right? And getting people to understand that, for example, they may love music, but they may not like some of the things they would have to do as a professional musician. And also getting them to understand that in the words of Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, meaning that the information they're receiving from vaunted studio teachers and the people at the very core of elitist hierarchies may not have accurate, up-to-date information. So I also asked them to do an informational interviewing process where I often foreground them reaching out to people who are just a little bit ahead of them, as well as people who are big aspirational reaches, to get more on the ground, up-to-date information that is specific to their needs. I cannot teach based on content in an environment where up to 50% of my students may be from other countries, right? So I have to teach people navigation skills.
Yep. Yeah, no, definitely. Those aspirational the interviews, that's something that I actually sort of use with my own students as well. And they come away inspired but informed, and it's just they've kind of like created their own texts as well, of which that they can sort of build upon, which is super useful. I was actually just wondering, with your approach with the teaching and learning, asking all those deep questions, have there been some students even modeling this with each other? Have you sort of noticed that culture sort of developing and growing amongst themselves?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I try to do is to enact classrooms as sort of sites of trauma-free practice. And I do this sometimes by it can be very heavy-handed to talk about trauma, and also the word trauma is very politicized in the United States right now. So it's what I try to do is to model this in many different ways. So one thing I've done a lot of is taking a page from the psychologist Carol Dweck's growth mindset, is to continually model process praise. So foregrounding not praise on inherent ability, but praise based on strategy, on effort, on perseverance, on risk taking. And I mean, literally, I for my days of teaching kids piano, I still have a large store of gold stars. So sometimes I like literally give people gold stars for just like taking a chance, continually just like using a lot of laughter in classroom environments. And it also requires putting myself on the line a lot and qualifying my statements with my artistic practice and my own lived experience. I lived through involuntary brain surgery this year as well. And I went through this whole thing where I was like, I didn't even realize I could take a leave of absence. So strong is the work ethic and the drive to conceal suffering in the cultures in which I work. So I think also like modeling my own frailty or my vulnerability, my need for help. And in particular, I would just offer that sharing the work of teaching and learning with students, not abrogating my responsibility, but teaching with, has also made it much more resonant and easier for me in a time of great professional stress. I teach in 2 unsecured contracts. So COVID also threatened my livelihood plus my health at the same time. So thinking through that made my teaching more resonant, more joyous, and in some ways lifts the load or the expectation that I place on myself.
Good on you, Tanya. That's brilliant. Well done, and well done for getting through the year. It sounds like you've had quite a challenging one. So keep on being strong. You're amazing.